So this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the most good you can do and effective altruism. So some of you will be familiar with what effective altruism is, others won't. So let's start by talking about that. This is what Wikipedia tells you about it if you go there. And it's pretty accurate too. One of the things you need to know about it is that this is quite a new movement. If you'd gone to Wikipedia 5 years ago, you would not have found an entry for effective altruism. But it is, as this says, both a movement and a philosophy. A philosophy not in the strict academic sense of the term, but a philosophy in the broader sense of an approach to life. So the altruism part of that is the idea that we ought to be living so that at least a significant part of what we do is concerned to make the world a better place, is concerned to think about others rather than just ourselves and those who are close to us. But the second part of the effective part of it is that in doing that, whatever we are doing in the way of resources, whether we're donating money, whether we're putting our time and energy into it, we ought to be using that as effectively as possible to do the most good that we can. If we're making some kind of commitment, why do less good than we could? That's the essential idea of effective altruism. Now, of course, you have to say then, well, what do you mean by doing good? That's not such an obvious notion. So here's some suggestions, not exactly originally mine, but drawn from a blog by Holden Karnofsky, who I'll be introducing you to a little later in the talk and telling you why he's a significant person in the effective altruism movement. So Holden had a blog in which he set out what he thought were the characteristic values of effective altruists. And as you see, the first point he starts with is that when we talk about improving the world, making the world a better place, that is what we mean. We are really taking a universal perspective. We're not saying, I would like to make my community a better place, unless the best thing that you can do for the world is to make your community a better place. That's possible in some circumstances, but it may also not be the case. It may be the case that you can do more, you can make a bigger difference for good by directing your efforts to other parts of the world. If that's so, then that's what effective altruists will say that you should do. Then the question is, well, okay, so we have that universal perspective, but we still need some values as to what makes the world a better place. And the simple answer, the sort of answer which you can get, if you like, it's the lowest common denominator answer, the answer in which you can most easily get a consensus, is it's improving well-being. It's reducing suffering and increasing happiness, something along those lines. So it's an answer that utilitarians for the last couple of centuries, since Jeremy Bentham, would give, but not only utilitarians. This is not a movement only for utilitarians, although I think all utilitarians certainly ought to be effective altruists, but not everybody who is an effective altruist needs to be a utilitarian. Most of us think that well-being matters, reducing suffering is a good thing, even if we think, for example, that there are some absolute moral rules that we should never violate, which means that we're not utilitarians but hold some other kind of ethic. As well as well-being, premature death is a thing to be avoided. Again, that's something that we would agree with normally. There might be extreme circumstances where life is so full of suffering that it's not, but otherwise we would think it is, and therefore if we can save lives, that's a good thing to do. There's a reference in here to animal suffering, and that's something that I've been very concerned with throughout my career. But again, some effective altruists are very concerned about animal suffering, others are less concerned about it. So there's no party line here, there's just a range of different views that are held. And lastly, this notion of expected value comes in. Obviously, when we're trying to improve the world, we may embark on various plans, schemes, with varying degrees of success. What we need to do before we decide on which of these schemes to embark on is to have some idea of the likelihood of success. And sometimes the likelihood of success will be very high, but success, if we achieve it, will be relatively small. We have, say, $1,000 to donate to a charity, and we give it to the Against Malaria Foundation, which distributes bed nets in regions where children die of malaria. The chances that we will contribute to saving a life are high. On the other hand, if we give it to an organisation that's trying to lobby for a stronger stance against climate change, the chances of success of us making any difference to that issue are very small. But the payoff, if we did make a difference, might be very large. So it's difficult, but we need to sort of try to think about those odds and form some estimate as to whether we want to go in for advocacy for an important cause with a big payoff but a low chance of success, or something that will have a smaller payoff and a high chance of success. It's expected value that we're talking about here. Okay, so now, having given you the rudiments of the ideas, I want you to meet some of the people who are effective altruists and who've been important in getting this young movement going, and that will give you a bit of an idea, I think, of where they're coming from and what they're concerned with and why they've changed their lives in the way that they have. And I'm starting with Toby Ord. Toby got interested in the ideas that I've been talking about when he was a graduate student at the University of Oxford. He was living on a studentship, on a scholarship, which was paying him about £14,000 a year. What's that, $25,000, something along those lines, I suppose. And Oxford is not a cheap city to live in, but nevertheless, he felt he really had enough. He was meeting his needs, even could save enough to go across to France for the summer holidays. So he felt he had what he needed, and he wouldn't really need to live on significantly more. And he was heading for an academic career, and he was going to start earning more once he got out of graduate school and got a job. But he thought, suppose that when my income goes up, my expenditure doesn't go up. I keep living roughly on what I'm living on now, adjusted for inflation, of course. And what could I then do with the rest that might make a difference to the world? So he did that calculation. He worked out what he might expect to earn throughout his career, going on a normal kind of academic trajectory, and added all that up, deducted an amount roughly equivalent to his studentship, multiplied by the number of years that he'd be around, and that left him, he found, with a large sum of money. So what could he then do with that amount? So then he looked around for what you could do if you gave to a really effective charity, cost-effective charity. And he chose an organisation that does this. Trachoma is the largest cause of preventable blindness in the world. It's a condition that probably doesn't exist in the United States, but exists in developing countries, particularly where hygiene is not good and often where there's a lot of dust in the air. And it's a kind of microorganism that gets into your eye, and at first nothing much happens. You feel a bit of itchiness, but gradually the eyeball gets scarred, your vision becomes blurred, and probably by the time you're maybe 40 or somewhere around then, you'll start to lose your sight altogether. Now it's eminently treatable. It's treatable by very cheap preventive treatment, and there are organisations that go to developing countries and provide clinics that do that, and here you see one in North Africa, in a French part of North Africa, that's treating children for this condition. So there's some debate about the cost per case of blindness prevented. Might be $25, might be $100, somewhere in that range. It's still very cheap. And when Toby did that calculation, the upshot was that with the amount of money that he could save and donate, he could prevent 80,000 people from going blind. And he thought, that's a huge amount of good that I could do just by living more modestly than I might otherwise. And he therefore decided to do that. As I said in the previous slide, he pledged to live on something close to his studentship and to donate the rest. But he wanted more people to know about this opportunity, as he saw it, an opportunity to do good that perhaps a lot of people don't know about. So he set up an organisation called Giving What We Can, which essentially told people about some very cost-effective charities and encouraged them not to do what Toby was doing, but to pledge to give 10% of their income to effective charities. So Giving What We Can now has, I'm not sure what the figure is, but I think it passed 1,000 a while ago. So more than 1,000 people who've pledged to give 10% of their income, and that's adding up to a substantial sum, of course, as they go through life doing that. Somebody else who's also living more modestly than she needs to, and giving quite a lot away, is Julia Wise, who lives in Boston, near Boston. She didn't come to this through philosophy. She came to it just, in a sense, on her own, through realizing that she's incredibly fortunate to be living in a country like the United States, where she can quite easily meet all her basic needs, where her children, she has children, and she does now have one and is expecting another. Her children are not going to die from malaria or diarrhea or measles. If they do get ill, they're going to get excellent health care. And Julia realized that there are so many people in the world who are just less fortunate than she is. And so she decided that she was going to live modestly and give what she can to help those people. And when she met her now husband, Jeff Kaufman, she persuaded him that that was what he wanted to do as well. And they're doing it together now. So there was a time when they were not earning very much. Even then, they gave a third of their income to effective charities. Now they're earning more and they're giving half. And if you want to get to know Julia and how she thinks about these issues, she has a great blog called givinggladly.com, and you can read about how she lives, how she makes decisions. She even discusses, for example, her decision to have a child, which, you know, at first she wasn't sure, given that having a child reduces the amount that you have to give away. So she's quite personal in discussing the way she thinks about these issues, and it's well worth reading. Third person is Will McCaskill, who was also a graduate student at Oxford, helped Toby Ord in establishing Giving What We Can. The slide is out of date. He's just been appointed as an associate professor at Oxford, so he's back in Oxford now. And the book, Doing Good Better, is now out. So I certainly recommend you pick up that, as well as my own book, of course. But the distinctive contribution that Will has made is about choosing a career ethically. Now, I know for some of you this discussion will come a little late in this audience, but some of you maybe not. So Will thought that there's, one of the big things that you might make a big difference in is your career. After all, he did a calculation too, which coincidentally also ended up with a figure of 80,000, but in his case it was a calculation of how many hours the typical person spends working in their career. So he set up this an organisation called 80,000 Hours, which has a website as well. There it is, talking about ethical careers. Now, you might think that this is fairly obvious. If you want to have an ethical career, you should work for an effective charity. That would be a good thing to do. Or perhaps you should go to medical school and train to be a doctor and treat people in developing countries so that they have better health care. Well, those certainly are good things to do, but Will had an idea that for some people, not for everyone, but for some people, there might be a better thing to do. And that was to choose a career where you can earn more money. Not so that you can live more lavishly, but so that, like Toby and Julia, you can give a lot of money away. And of course, the more you earn, the more you have to give away. If Toby could do so much good on an academic salary, not that fabulous, especially not in Britain, where they're less, I'd say, than certainly the elite academic institutions here. But if Toby can do that, then imagine what you can do if you go to Wall Street and are successful there. Well, one of my Princeton students imagined exactly that and decided that that was what he was going to do. Although he too could have had a career, I think, as a philosopher, as an academic, because he was an outstanding philosophy student as an undergraduate at Princeton. But he turned down an offer to do graduate work at Oxford and went to Wall Street. And within a year of doing that, he was able to donate a six-figure sum to effective charities. He's now 4 years out and he's continuing to do that. So why is that a better thing to do than to work for a charity? The reasoning goes like this. Suppose you do apply for a job with an effective charity, let's say with Oxfam America, and you get that job. How much good have you actually done? Well, the good that you've done is not everything that you've actually done in that job, because Oxfam had that vacancy, advertised the vacancy, and appointed you, presumably from a field of others, which included some other well-qualified applicants. And if you hadn't decided to go into that area, the second best applicant in the field would have got the job. So the difference that you've made is the difference between what you can do and what the second best applicant in the field can do. And that's probably not a huge difference. But now suppose that you're giving $100,000 to Oxfam. That might be enough for them to set up 2 new positions, 2 completely additional positions, to which they can then appoint good people to do that work. So rather than just making the marginal difference between the best and second best applicant in an already existing position, you've added 2 positions, and in that sense you've made the difference, all the difference, that the 2 people working in those positions make. So that's why Will thought people ought to know about this. It's not going to be for everyone. Not everyone will want to do that. If their concern is to help the global poor, say, they might not want to work at Wall Street. They might have some reservations about that, understandably. Or it's possible that they'll do it for a while and then they'll see that their colleagues are driving better cars than they are, living in more luxurious penthouse apartments and so on, and they'll want to do the same. That's possible. But if you have the character that can do it and can continue to give, then it may be a very good thing to do and an ethical way to live. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the cause to choose. The examples I've given you are all from helping the global poor. And that is, I think, in fact, probably the cause that most effective altruists are concerned with. But you might say, well, why should they be? How do you choose which cause is going to do the most good? Sorry. This is a slide from the website of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, one of the larger organizations that advise people interested in being philanthropic, particularly advise people with large amounts of money to give away. And it's interesting to look at what they say, or perhaps what they don't say about this question. So they say here, giving money away is simple, giving away money effectively is an entirely different matter. Every effective altruist would agree with that statement. But look at a couple of things about how they picture the field of philanthropy. If you look at this little diagram, perhaps given that I've been talking about global poverty, you might say, where does that actually fit into this chart? It's not obvious. I mean, in a sense, it can fit in many places, right? It could fit into health and safety, could fit into education, could fit into economic security, could fit into human and civil rights, but it doesn't leap out at you from that chart. Whereas effective altruists would think that the difference between giving for health and safety, say, or education in the United States domestically and giving for those things in developing countries is one of the biggest and most vital decisions that you can make. Another curiosity that interests me in this area is that animal welfare causes just aren't anywhere on that chart. None of those categories really fit there. Okay, but there's a more serious problem that I have with this, and that is this kind of subjectivism or relativism about which is the best cause to give to. There's obviously no objective answer to the question which is the most urgent cause to give to. Well, I think not only is it not obvious that there's no objective answer, I think it's false. In at least some cases, there are objective reasons for preferring one cause than another, and I'll illustrate that by examples taken from the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors' own literature that they give out. So here's two examples. Those of you with longer memories may remember Ted Turner's gift to UN back in 1998, $1 billion gift, far the largest single gift given to the UN, to scale up health programs that were proven to be effective against killer diseases that kill children in developing countries. The cost per save at that time was estimated to be as low as $80 per life saved. That figure would have gone up now because there were more children dying then than there are now, because effectively there was less of these kinds of programs. There were more children not immunized against measles, easier to reach. There are still some, but they're in more remote places now. There were fewer children sleeping under bed nets in malaria-prone regions. Again, there are still some, but fewer, and so on. So obviously, as you pick the low-hanging fruit of saving the lives of children in developing countries, the cost will go up. So it's not $80 anymore, but that's what it was then, and it's still much lower than the cost for saving lives in this country. And here's the other example, a gift by Lucille Packard to establish a children's hospital in Palo Alto. You probably know that Palo Alto is not one of the poorer regions of the United States. In fact, it ranks third among the most affluent cities in the country. So if you build a new hospital in Palo Alto, you're providing healthcare services for a community that already is incomparably better provided with healthcare services than people in developing countries. And what you may end up doing are things like this, spending between 1 and 2 million to separate a pair of conjoined twins. Now, you know, it's great that those conjoined twins did get separated, but for 1 or 2 million, you could have perhaps saved 1,000 children in developing countries. So is it obvious that there's no objective answer as to which of these two gifts was the better one? Even better one on a dollar-for-dollar basis, of course. I think it's obvious that, in fact, Ted Turner's gift was the better gift because it saved more lives, reduced suffering more. So that's one example. And here's another one. You don't need such long memories to remember this one if you're following the papers. This just happened this year. Those of you who traveled to New York might have visited the Lincoln Center, maybe even attended a concert at what used to be known as the Avery Fisher Hall there. Well, you've attended your last concert at the Avery Fisher Hall. It's now the David Geffen Hall. And this is why. So, you know, again, I think that if you've got $100 million to donate, there are better things that you can do with it than renovate a concert hall which, you know, was adequate for attending conferences as far as I'm aware. I'm not aware that the roof was leaking or it was about to collapse or anything of that sort. It seems obvious to me that there are causes where you could have done more to relieve suffering or promote happiness than donating to either new or renovating concert halls, opera houses, and the like. Okay, now a further question that we need to consider is, I've talked about effective charities, but you might say, how do you know which charities are effective? Well, that's an important issue, and it's the fact that we now do have some good information about this that has made it possible, I think, for the effective altruism movement to really talk seriously about knowing what you're obtaining for your donations and knowing which of the charities that are highly effective. So I told you before that I would tell you a bit about Holden Karnofsky. This is Holden here, the bearded one. So Holden and Ellie were working for a hedge fund just before the global financial crisis, so they were making lots of money, and they were still pretty young, still in their 20s, a lot more money than they'd ever expected to be making, and they thought, and some of their other colleagues there thought, we really should give some of this away. We really should do something else with this. We don't need all of this money that we're earning. So a group of 8 of them got to discuss, they said, okay, so where should we give it? And they all came out with different sorts of ideas. And then they decided, look, why don't each of us pick our favourite charity, write to that charity, say, I'm considering making a substantial donation to you, but I would like to know what you will do with it, what that donation will achieve. And then when we've all done that, we'll get the results, we'll look at them, and we'll be able to work out which is the most effective charity to give to. So they did that. But they didn't get back the kind of information they wanted. Remember, these are hedge fund guys, they're pretty nerdy, they're used to handling lots of data to decide what investments the hedge fund should make. And the charities basically sent them back glossy brochures with pictures of smiling kids telling them that their donation would go to help these children, but no specifics about what it would do. So they called them up and they said, look, we wanted more information, this wasn't this. And they still didn't get the information. One of them said that information is confidential. Another accused them of spying for a rival agency on what they were doing. And basically they just didn't get it. So Holden and Ellie said, this is an incredible vacuum, a vacuum of information about charities, which are a really big part of American society. More than $300 billion is donated to charities in America each year. Most of that from individuals. And yet these individuals are clearly giving in a state of ignorance, because if we can't find this out, they're not finding it out, they don't know. The only information that was around really and was public was information about the proportion of income that goes to overheads, administration and fundraising. And that's really all that was there for people to use. Now, is that useful information? Well, yes and no. Yes, if 80% of the overheads are going, 80% of the income is going to overheads, forget it. That organisation is not worth donating to. But does the difference between 15 and 20%, or even 10 and 20%, really tell you anything about the effectiveness of the organisation? And most of the organisations that you would be donating to, the well-known ones, are probably somewhere in those sort of ballparks. And the answer is no, it doesn't. Because you can cut your administrative expenses, you can cut your staff down, but there's a cost to doing that. The cost is you are no longer supervising the programs that you're funding as thoroughly and carefully as you would be if you had more staff to do it. Or you're not evaluating lots of things that you could be cutting back on. So it might well be that the organisation that spends 20% on overheads is actually getting much better value out of the remaining 80% than the organisation that spends 10% on overheads is getting out of its remaining 90%. And so you might do much better to give to the one with the larger overhead. But what you really need to know, as Holden and Ellie realised, is what is happening on the ground, what the programs are achieving. And so that was what the information that really wasn't there, and that they decided that they would try and find. So they set up this organisation called GiveWell, which you can find online at givewell.org, and they've now reviewed hundreds of charities, represented by this pie chart here. As you see, there's a large amount of grey and a very thin slice of yellow or orange, whatever that is, which are their top charities. That doesn't mean that the rest of them are no good. What it does mean is the rest of them, or at least some of the rest of them, are too difficult to assess. They cannot get the information out of them that they really want. The information perhaps just doesn't exist. So they're only recommending the ones where both they get enough information to reach a judgment and the information is highly positive about the effectiveness of the charity. So that's why there's a small number of charities that they're recommending. Some people think that their criteria are too strict, and so if you look at this website, which this is the organisation I mentioned that Toby Ord set up, Giving What We Can, you find a slightly different list that they will recommend. And this is an organisation that I set up that was named after my previous book, The Life You Can Save, which also recommends charities go to Where to Donate, and it is also broader in its scope than GiveWell. But all of these websites provide you with better information than was available when effective altruism got going, which, as I say, is basically within the last decade. If you're interested in animal charities, there is now a relatively new organisation that's trying to do the same thing for that, called Animal Charity Evaluators, which is evaluating charities that work for animals. And let me say while I'm here, if you're interested in getting involved with organisations that are promoting effective altruism, there is a Chicago Effective Altruism group, and there are some people from that organisation in the audience. If you'd like to stand up and wave or something like that, people can identify you. And if you want to talk to them, they'll be hanging around afterwards somewhere and passing out some leaflets so that you can find out more about it. Okay, I want to wind up pretty soon because I want to make sure you have time for questions. But I just want to say a little bit about this issue of motivation. What is it that motivates effective altruists to do what they do? Are some people just naturally altruistic and others not? How does that work? Well, there's a lot more research in a way to be done to answer that kind of question. But there are some ways in which altruism actually is rewarding, paradoxically, for the altruist. And here's one of them. This is a quote from a book by Canadian philosopher Richard Caption called Reasonable Self-Esteem. His book is about self-esteem, the importance of self-esteem for feeling good about your life, and essentially saying that if you're a reasonable person, and I hope you all are reasonable people, you will in some sense already be aware that to ignore the interests of others whose well-being is equally significant as your own makes it difficult for you to have the kind of self-esteem that you otherwise would. And I think we do know that there are other people in the world who, as Julia Wise said, who are sort of just less fortunate and whose well-being does matter as much as our own. So that's one motivating factor, if you like, to increase our own feeling of feeling good about ourselves and our lives. Here's Holden and Ellie again. They gave up a lot of money to leave the hedge fund. They're working now for a non-profit. They pay themselves okay, but certainly nothing like they would be earning if they'd stayed at the hedge fund. But they don't feel that they've made any kind of sacrifice. They feel that their lives are exciting, stimulating, worthwhile, intellectually energizing, and they're excited to be in a position where they're trying to do as much good as they can. And I'll leave you with just one more example, which somebody who was a close friend of mine, unfortunately no longer with us, worked in the animal movement, was perhaps the most effective strategist in the animal rights movement in the United States in the last quarter of the 20th century. And this is a quote from an interview that I did with him when he knew that he was dying. He had esophageal cancer. He knew that he had at most months to live. And I interviewed him partly to get down the kinds of strategies that he was using to help others in the animal movement, but also because he was so calm and, you know, had so much equanimity in the face of death. I did ask him questions about how he felt about that in his life. And he said that he felt he'd used his life well. So, you know, while he would have liked to have more of it, he wasn't so troubled by the fact that he wasn't going to have much more of it. And this is the way he put it, that he wanted to feel that his life amounted to more than just consuming products and generating garbage. And unfortunately, so much of the consumerist advertising we see, the consumerist ethic, is really just about that. And we know from lots of studies that that puts you on a kind of hedonic treadmill where you need to do more in order to maintain your level of happiness. In contrast, Henry's view was that if you look back and think that you've done the best you can to make this a better place for others, that that's something that gives you a kind of satisfaction that doesn't disappear. And as he said, it's not a sense of duty, but rather this is what I want to do. I feel best when I'm doing it well. So thank you. I will leave you with that, and I'll be very happy to take questions.
The dilemma as I see it is there are kids dying in the developing world, and there is also cultural support. Supporting Chicago Humanities Festival allows us to hear you to speak. How do I reconcile those two conflicting interests?
This is where I'm going to be annoying, you see. Some people here. Look, I think it's, you know, it's really great that there are cultural festivals and events where I speak, but I do feel that if there are, and current figures show there's still over 6 million kids dying from preventable poverty-related diseases, that seems to me to take priority. That seems to me to be more urgent. So, you know, yes, people can still come together and talk about things and put on lectures. I know that in some cases there will be good speakers that you will miss, but there are plenty of outlets for learning about ideas and other ways of getting it. So I would have to say, if somebody asked me to donate to this festival, I would say, I'm sorry, that's not where my priorities lie.
We'll take our next question over here.
There was a recent article about the amount of money it would take to eradicate malaria permanently, and it was in, I believe, the hundreds of billions, and then the estimate was that the benefit economically would be trillions in growth. I'm, you know, shortcutting it there. Do you think it's worth spending to completely eradicate malaria?
Look, I'm not really enough of an expert on malaria itself. I definitely think it's worth spending a lot to continue to dramatically reduce malaria. And by the way, we have been reducing it quite dramatically. Recent studies have shown that the number of deaths, child deaths from malaria, is something like half of what it was, even though the population in areas where there is malaria is probably larger. But we're shrinking the impact that it has, and we are reducing the prevalence of it as well. Yes, clearly, if you can actually eradicate it, then you don't need to keep doing these other things. You don't need to distribute the bed nets. You don't need to develop a vaccine for it, and so on. So it's quite possible that that argument is right, and that we should be trying to actually completely eradicate it, as we've done with smallpox. That's a great example that clearly has paid off. But as I say, I can't vouch for the figures that you mentioned. If they're right, it does seem like that would be good money well spent.
We'll take our next question over here.
How are these principles used by or should be used by governments?
What?
How should the principles be used by governments? So I would certainly like governments to be more effective in the aid that they're giving. I would also like, particularly the United States government, to increase the amount of aid that it's giving. The United States gives, I think, quite a shamefully small amount of foreign aid as a proportion of gross domestic product, whereas some countries, the Scandinavian nations and the Netherlands and now the United Kingdom, meet the UN target of 0.7% of gross domestic product. In other words, 70 cents in every $100 that the country earns. The United States currently giving, I think, about 23 cents in every $100, about a third of what those nations are giving. So I would like to see that raised. In fact, President Obama, when a candidate, said that he wanted to raise that to, I think he wanted to double the amount that was being given. He hasn't done that. So I certainly think that should be increased. But I have to accept that governments have direct responsibilities to their own citizens, so they can't look at it in a sort of clean slate way that I would do. And of course, governments want to get re-elected, so they can't get too far ahead of the voters in terms of what they're doing. So I think you can only ask for quite progressive increments in what governments are doing in this way and in this form of thinking. But if you look at it just within domestic expenditure, then I think, yes, talking about effectiveness and which forms of expenditure are the most effective certainly is something that governments should be doing.
Our next question.
How do you feel our daily food choices fits into effective altruism?
Well, as I said, a lot of effective altruists are concerned about animal suffering. And one of the, well, I'd say within the United States, perhaps the greatest form of animal suffering, certainly the greatest form that humans inflict on animals, is factory farming. So organisations that can shrink the power of factory farming, persuade people not to buy products of factory farming, and therefore reduce the number of animals that go through this confinement and really appalling conditions for animals. I think they are effective in ways of reducing animal suffering. Now some people will say, yeah, but that's the suffering of pigs or chickens or something like that. That doesn't count as much as the suffering of humans. But given the numbers involved, even if you discount the suffering of animals quite heavily, you might still find that the most effective thing to do. Plus there's a kind of an extra bonus that you get, and that is that the livestock industry is a major contributor to greenhouse gases. So if you're concerned about climate change, and you should be, then trying to get people to move away from animal foods to more plant-based foods is also going to be a win for human beings.
Next question.
When we're talking about effectiveness, I guess I'd put this in the teach a man to fish versus giving a fish quandary, that educating people and teaching people how to help themselves in developing countries can be a more time-intensive and economically expensive way to help people out of poverty than just giving them $100 or $200. But how do you measure that? Because one seems like a short-term investment and one seems longer term, but the payoff is different.
Yes, you're right, and education in particular, the payoff is quite long-term. Some of the other ones, the payoff is not that long-term. For example, not exactly teaching somebody to fish, but developing new methods of producing rice is something that Oxfam America has been engaged in Southeast Asia. And you can then see the yields quite quickly, right? So you're, in a year or two, you can see the yields and you can get results back. So it will depend on the programs. But you're right that some programs are more difficult to evaluate because they're long-term. One of the benefits of education, though, has been shown to be, particularly if you educate girls, that you reduce their fertility they're spacing their births more, their children are more likely to survive, and their children are more likely to be healthy. So that's something that we already know. You know, in a way, there are already longer-term studies that have done that. You don't have to look at a particular charity that's doing it now. And you can feed that in, and you can then say, well, what we really need to see is whether a particular intervention actually leads to more girls attending school. And that's something you can see pretty much immediately, and then we have the knowledge about what the benefits of more girls attending school are going to be.
We will take our last question over here. I do want to remind you that there will be a book signing afterwards. It'll be on the level that you entered in on my left side of that space.
So my question is, how do you assess the moral choice of Holden and Ellie to stop being hedge fund managers and making boatloads of money and giving it away, and instead working for a nonprofit? And more generally, why shouldn't all of us who have chosen to do something that we think is valuable in and of itself be condemned for instead choosing to earn as much possible money as we can and then giving it away?
Well, as I said, not everybody is really suited to that. I mean, some people just would feel that they could not work in that environment, wouldn't enjoy it, wouldn't do well at it, therefore. So I certainly don't condemn people, nor would Will McCaskill, who take a different path, who say that path is just not for me. I've got to do something that I can really feel involved with, feel that I'm supporting intrinsically in a way, directly, rather than in this more indirect way. As for Holden and Ellie, I mean, their problem was that if they'd stayed at the hedge fund, they wouldn't have known which charities were effective to give to, so they might have ended up wasting the money that they were giving away. Plus, now, you know, GiveWell, as also the Life You Can Save, tries to track the amount of money that moves through their website. So if somebody goes to the Life You Can Save, goes to the which charities to donate to page, looks at a charity, then they have a button to click on to go to that charity. If they then go to that charity and donate $1,000 to that charity, we get that information back on our website. So we can track, at least, maybe that's not all of the money we're influencing, but we can at least track some of it. So we can know, and GiveWell can know, that millions of dollars, in GiveWell's case it's tens of millions of dollars, have gone to more effective charities through their work. And so Ellie and Holden would have had to earn a lot of money and give a lot of money away, even if they could have found an effective charity to give it to do more than they've actually achieved. Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry.